Welcome to the Microsoft 365 Developer Podcast with your host, Jeremy Thake. Each week, you'll catch us speaking to expert developers about new tech, lessons learned, and opinions in this space. Okay, welcome back, AC. I know it's been a few weeks. We've been vacations and escalations and all sorts to get us to schedule this call on a Friday.
Yeah, couple little tech issues. We tried to record one, and then I was like having epic failure. So I apologize for missing out a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, that's right. Tech fail. I should have got my dad to give you a call to help you.
Oh my God, it was It was the resulting. Good thing is that it exposed a problem that I've been dealing with for like 2 or 3 months, or like 2 months, and was able to finally figure it out, which ended up resolving it. So like this weird little nasty little thing, but finally got it fixed, and we're here now. Or at least when this gets published, will be proof that we're here now.
When people actually listen.
Right.
So it's been a few weeks. We've had Seb on with declarative copilots. We just had Joey Glock from the Teams team on about custom engine copilots in Teams AI library.
Yep.
Did you take a listen to any of those? Have you had time?
I did. Yeah. Those were really good. Anything copilot is obviously interesting right now to a lot of people. Those two topics were really good. I'm glad that you broke those out into separate interviews.
Yeah.
I don't want to say it's hard to understand when you would use one over the other, but there's still it gets a little confusing on the delineation between the two. It's more or less like the scenario of the delineation between the two is what I mean.
Yeah.
But they were really helpful in understanding like the different things that you can do with those. So I was a big fan. I've listened to both of them at least twice now. Just to get a better feel for. I think I listened to Joey's I think I listened to it 2.5 times. I did a 9-hour car ride recently. I was one of the people that got totally screwed by the the picture show me where CrowdStrike touched you right thing. And I was a Delta victim. And so I got to drive 9 hours from Florida to Virginia at the last minute to go to a client and then back. And that's when you release the episodes. I'm like, cool, I'll listen to this. And a hell of a lot more stuff too.
Well, for those that are listening to the show, thank you. I went out for beers with Joey, and he was like, "Yeah, it was really cool. There was a bunch of people at work pinging me saying good show," and I was like, "I'm really surprised there's that many people listening to it from Microsoft." I was like, "It's working."
Yeah, it was good. It was a good episode. It made me really want to get back to my desk so we could do this soon. So
yeah, right, and to actually chat through things. And so we've been talking about what are we going to talk about this week with that being covered, and a few things coming soon that I want to talk to Basie about. We can't quite talk about yet.
Yeah.
And I mean, you've been on a bit of a tear with SharePoint Embedded, and we had Reed Carlsberg on. God, must have been like 18 months ago now to talk about what was it called?
Repository as a service.
Unfortunately, they got wise to the fact that name wasn't a good name. And in true Microsoft style, we renamed it. And so now it's called SharePoint Embedded, which I think makes a lot more sense in terms of what it's actually doing.
It's not a real Microsoft product until it's got 2 or 3 names. So, I mean, that's one thing. We check that box.
We don't listen to public preview in GA. If it's had 3 names, it's stable.
Yeah. And I mean, I'll start with, I'm not as big of a fan of this name of what was landed on compared to other ones that were being optional, because I feel like the first thing I have to tell people when we talk about SharePoint Embedded, I'm like, cool, this is SharePoint Embedded. No, it doesn't run on your phone. It's not a mobile solution because it's got embedded in the name. I'm like, oh, so what is it? So, yeah. So
how did you get involved in this? What was obviously you missed a SharePoint guy since, 2000 and whatever, but what made you get pulled into this sphere?
Well, okay. So when I saw, I guess the shorter version of this story is that I got word that it was going to be announced back at Build 2023, I think, when Jeff Teeper talked about it, I think in a keynote or in one of his state of Microsoft 365 or state of SharePoint sessions type things.
Yeah.
And that's when it was repository as a service. And so I understood it to be, hey, it's SharePoint but it's just APIs. Didn't really gel exactly. I mean, I understood what it was, but it didn't really gel as much to what appreciate how important it was. But so that was in May of 2023. And then late in the summer, early fall of 2023, when it was still private preview, right before it reached public preview. The guy who owns it for Microsoft is, we know each other from like way, way back. And I didn't know that he was working on this. So he reached out to me and was like, hey, want to get some content created for this. So I got more involved in it, learned a lot more about it, got to read up on a bunch of stuff, built 2 Microsoft Learning modules for them. And then earlier this year, in March of this year, I built a 2-day, it's kind of like a workshop. Kind of, I mean, if you've heard of airlifts or dev kitchens, or it was a 2-day workshop. And so it was essentially like presentations and hands-on labs for a bunch of ISVs who wanted to build stuff with it. So they had me come in, build all the content, and then deliver the content over the course of 2 days. So,
so what is it for those that maybe missed Reed's interview? And I think often sometimes it's good to get a non-Microsofty to talk about this and give their own personal feel. But how do you explain what SharePoint Embedded is?
So there's 2 ways that I explain it. And so if you give me a little bit of grace, give me a few minutes to kind of explain this to people. So I'm going to talk to 2 different audiences. So the first audience I'll talk to is the easiest one because it's the shortest answer. So those of you who are longtime SharePoint developers or SharePoint consultants, when your customers have come to you and said, I want SharePoint, but I don't want to use the SharePoint web interface. I want to store documents in document libraries, and I want my app to be able to use them, but I don't want my users to get to the documents in the document libraries via the SharePoint web interface or through any of the other integration points that Microsoft has in 365 or Office or whatever. I want to do that. And the answer is always like, yep, we can't do that until now. So effectively, that's what it is. It's basically document libraries. It's just a SharePoint document library where you store your content. And by default, the only way you can get to that content is through an API, specifically Microsoft Graph. So you're responsible for creating the entire user experience and business logic that wraps up the app. So that's one audience that I would talk to. So all those scenarios are like going, this is what I need. And I'm like, well, now you have it. Yeah. So that's one. To everyone else who's like, I don't fall into that camp. So for consultants or developers who are used to building apps or have worked with apps or built apps for customers where they've said, we need a way to be able to store content, not like records, not like records in a database, but we have like files. So images or PDFs or statements of work. We have a way that we need to collect content from users or we need to be able to store our content. And we need to have a solution to where we're going to store that. And so today, the answer has been go put it in some sort of like a document repository type thing. So you could do that with something like Azure storage blobs and having all your stuff in like Azure in blobs or in files. But that's just cheap, like it stores files. That's it. It doesn't do anything else.
Yeah.
A lot of times when you build an application like that, you have an additional need for things that are more document centric or document management centric features. So maybe it's as simple as just versioning, major.minor versioning. Maybe it's as simple as having some sort of a workflow associated with it, like an approval workflow. Maybe if you want to go a little bit farther with that and you want to build more advanced like enterprise content management capabilities, like any kind of like security and compliance or sensitivity labels or document retention, or you need to be able to support like records holds. You would have to build all those features on your own, and there's a lot of work associated with that. So what another option would be for this is where usually when customers would come and say, well, why don't I just use SharePoint and store all that content inside of SharePoint, but we don't tell anybody what document library it's in inside of our SharePoint investments, and instead we just tell them to go use this web app. Yeah. Well, that's one option, but it wouldn't really like hide like your experience. If you have a very specific workflow you want somebody to walk through, or you only want them to see certain content,
they're going
to guess work so well
in the browser and things.
Yeah, exactly. It didn't work so well. So what Microsoft did is in creating SharePoint Embedded, what they essentially said was, okay, you get your document storage, and yes, over in Azure, super cheap. But instead of building all those features with your own code that you would have to then maintain, and if you want to build something that's like enterprise ready, you'd have to get all those certifications and everything for your application to support all those different requirements for different document management requirements. Instead, why don't you just use SharePoint, specifically SharePoint Embedded? Now, all of that content is to address the issue that I was just kind of talking through. You're going to get access to all of the first class or first in class ECM capabilities that SharePoint has already offered customers, like versioning, document retention, records holds, search, security and compliance, sensitivity labels. I could go on, but you're going to have access to all of that, all of those features. But the one difference is that it's essentially like buying or getting SharePoint, but deleting like the web root for the entire application. So there's no way to get to the content.
Yeah, it's like an extreme white labeling type thing.
So that's the other way I like to explain this, is that SharePoint Embedded, all those people who have been asking for a white label version of SharePoint, that's what this is. Now, there's one thing though that I do see people getting tripped up with, and that's SharePoint Embedded is SharePoint document libraries, full stop, right? There's no lists in there. There's no pages, none of that stuff. It is just document libraries for content storage. So what that allows us to do then is that we have the ability to build, or we have to build, a full-blown web app, or whatever app we're going to build. We're going to build this app, and we're going to control the entire web experience. So we'll talk about some scenarios where it makes sense.
Yeah.
But what this does is it now allows the developer or the customer have full control over the user experience for the end users for that solution that they're trying to build. And then on top of that, the other thing that I think that is a really good value add for this, and there's kind of two pieces to this. One of them is that if you build this app that your customer then uses, take all of that content that the app is storing is not required, but by default, all that content is going to be stored in the customer's tenant, not into the people who are built the app and that are running the app.
Right.
But all that content is being stored in my Microsoft 365 tenant.
So you're not in the risk of having to look after those documents and customers having to trust you to look after them.
Exactly. And that content is, think about like I get a separate instance of SharePoint. So in Microsoft terms, you get a separate partition. But you get a separate instance of SharePoint inside of your 365 tenant where all that content is going to reside. And that gives us two really cool things about it. Number one, I own all the content, and I'm the only one that I still have access to all my content on my own tenant. But what it also means is that, and just one little footnote, all that content in that tenant does not count against your Microsoft 365 entitlement. So like quotas or like storage or anything, everything in your SharePoint Embedded partition doesn't count towards or against 365, right? So they're two separate things.
Yep.
But what it does do is that I can optionally turn on a flag on those document libraries that I'm using inside of SharePoint Embedded, or for my entire app that's using tens of thousands of these document libraries. We call them containers, not like Docker containers, like storage containers. What that allows us to do when we turn this flag on is we can say all that content that was kind of invisible to the rest of 365, now I don't want it to be invisible. Now I want it to just show up. And so then you could optionally, for your app, if the business makes sense, if it makes sense for the business case, your app could then, all of your users that are using Outlook could attach a file to it by just doing the file. I want to attach a file from my cloud
in the feed and
file
pickers and Copilot and things like that.
Exactly. Yeah. So they'll be able to pick from content that lives in SharePoint, their existing SharePoint Online tenant, OneDrive, maybe Microsoft Teams, and your custom SharePoint Embedded app that's also installed that you could pick from. And all that content would then be visible or would be available via Microsoft Search. So it'd all be indexed. And you would then be able to leverage all of the other investments you have in 365, including like Microsoft Purview, that would do all the security and compliance and all the sensitivity labels and all that stuff. So then you don't have to go build all of that extra stuff. And then all the AI capabilities that that are adding to 365 you'll also be able to leverage all of that stuff as well. You have to opt into that, but it's just something else to kind of say, like, I don't have to go build all that extra stuff for my document storage thing. The only thing I have to go build is just the web interface or the desktop interface to my app.
It's files in a box.
Pretty much, right?
I wonder why they didn't call it OneDrive Embedded. There must be a background on that.
I don't know. There were so many other. I know there was a lot of names that were being bantered around.
The PowerPoint deck of what it could be called.
It was so the guy that I worked with a lot on this. So I know you've had Reed on here. The guy that owned it, Sham, and then the like one of the main engineers that I worked with, a guy named Mark Wendell. I just remember some of our conversations. Like we get on the call to kind of get an update on what's going on, and I'm like, so now what's the name? So it's like, we're using this, and we're kind of this. I'm like, all right, I'm just going to keep calling.
So I had like Mark was on the podcast as well, if I remember, and we tag teamed that with both of them.
Oh yeah, I had to come up with my own code name in all of the content that I was writing for Microsoft, and in the and for that 2-day dev summit that we did. That's right, it was called a dev summit. That 2-day dev workshop that I did, and I just did like this global search and replace across everything. It even like bit me during the workshop at one point. Someone's like, "Yeah, the code's looking for something like this," and I'm like, "Oh crap, that's yeah."
What was interesting was back then they talked about, and actually in I think the post that you've written about this too, you had it, was that Microsoft Loop actually uses this as an implementation thing. So rather than going away and building a file storage system themselves, they actually implemented on top of the SharePoint embedded stack. And then what they did was they used Fluid Relay, which is our open source tech, to do the real-time collab in their client experience. But I just found out, actually just yesterday, coincidentally, that there's another product coming out that Outlook are shipping, which I don't think is out, so I'm not going to mention the name, that also uses this too. And it totally makes sense. Like, it's like, why would they go build that from scratch? Like, and so they've got a few good, what you call them, 2P type scenarios, where they're building on top of things that exist within the stack and taking advantage of that.
Microsoft Designer is also
and Designer,
yeah. So Loop is a really good scenario for this. So a lot of people are very familiar with Loop. So think about it like this: Microsoft built Microsoft Loop, which is like a collaboration OneNote kind of experience type thing. All the content lives in your tenant. It lives in a SharePoint embedded instance a SharePoint embedded partition in your tenant. So when you create a new like Loop, I think they're called workspaces. When you create like a new Loop, when you create a new Loop workspace, I don't know the exact details of this, but think about it like this. It's a JSON file that is being stored inside of a document library inside your tenant. Yeah. So every time you create, so for the developers out there, every time you create a new container, right, a storage container, under the covers, it's creating a site collection that has a single document library in it, and that's it. So that's how, in SharePoint, that's how everything is being created and stored, just a single document library. And the limits on this too, for like how you can build things out, it's really interesting. Like the information architecture, I think, is the thing that when people start getting in this, it starts to go over their heads. We can talk about that later if you want to go into that. But I remember we had a couple conversations about that. And then one of the guys from Microsoft, he owns the entire storage infrastructure for SharePoint. And he's like, let me just explain to you kind of what your limits are. And then he says it, and I'm like, oh, so I was thinking about like putting folders in my containers, but you're telling me I can have 100,000 containers per app per tenant. I'm like, so I'm going to have lots of containers in my app. And he's like, yeah, more like, you want to think about more like that. So
interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. But there's a lot of interest in this. There's a lot of stuff that you can do with this. I'm seeing a lot of customers
we've done this a lot. When I was a consultant, we isolated away site collections for particular business applications we were building, because you could have different site collection admins on it and control kind of like backup scenarios more granularly than normal site collections.
Mm-hmm.
But I know, the other aspect of this is the SharePoint embedded, like an admin of the SharePoint farm doesn't necessarily have to get involved. I say the farm, the cloud doesn't necessarily have to get involved in these, in the fact that the ISV, the software vendor, or the dev team can effectively own this without necessarily the SharePoint admin getting in the way, which is what used to happen with us when we'd go, hey, we need new site collection back then in the farm. We'd have to go through the SharePoint admin that often would be you shall not pass and put his stake in the floor.
Yeah, one of the things I think that it helps to kind of talk through some scenarios, because people really start to understand what this has to offer when you think through some scenarios. So like, let's say, for example, that because there's a whole like single tenant, multi-tenant, there's a whole licensing thing that like it breaks down the licensing challenges that we run into in the past.
Yeah.
Think about like a structured user experience. So let's say you had a very specific path that you wanted your customers to follow. So like, for example, let's say that Microsoft is running a conference and you have a bunch of external speakers, internal speakers. You're going to have a bunch of vendors who are going to be exhibiting on the conference floor. You need people to go through a very prescriptive path. Like vendors need to go through and they need to have a contract that they need to walk through and sign a waiver for probably some stuff. They need to probably submit payment for something. They need to pick their booth size, etc. There's a whole a very sequential steps that they need to follow, and they need to make sure they do it in a very specific order. Or on the speaker side, say, here's your speaker contract. You need to fill out the speaker contract, and then a certain number of days before the conference, you need to submit your slide deck and your
we all do that
resources.
on time as speakers.
Say again.
We all do that on time as speakers.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, I think I'm speaking at a conference in 2 weeks, and my slides were due about 2 weeks ago. They'll be there. My excuse is that's okay. Actually, if I see anybody in DC, you'll understand why you won't find my slides, because I'm pretty much doing like all demos across everything. Which I'm going to play the developer card. Developers don't want to see slides; they want to see demos. So I'm good. But the cool thing is that not Microsoft has all that content. There are people that are going to be running, my app is going to have all that content. Microsoft is using an app that either they made themselves or some third-party vendor built it, and Microsoft was using it as a service, subscribe to the app as a service. But all that content for the conference, you need to make sure that all that content is saved in the Microsoft tenant, because maybe it's a conference like Build that's coming up. And so you're going to have a bunch of announcements, but they're all under embargo. So you want to protect all the content. You can have it all be applied to all the same sensitivity labels that Microsoft uses with their own purview inside of their 365 tenant. Now, here's where it gets kind of cool with this, right? This is great for let's say Microsoft Build the app. That's a single tenant type application. But one of the cool things about this is that the people that use the app, they don't necessarily have to be in Microsoft's tenant. They don't have to be a Microsoft employee. They don't have to be licensed for Microsoft 365 or SharePoint to use your app, even though that's where the content is being stored. It's totally separate. So you can get away without even using or having to go through and get licenses to Microsoft 365, to SharePoint Online for everybody that's using your app. Because when they're using a SharePoint embedded app, even though the content is stored in SharePoint Online and in the user's or the customer's partition, it's not counting towards 365 entitlements or against them. So you don't have to have these specially licensed users. Furthermore, those users don't even have to have a Microsoft account, because Microsoft Intra supports federated identities from say Google or from, well, I know Google. I was going to say Facebook or Apple, but I'm not sure what all it supports. But Facebook, I think it does. But you could have one of these third-party identity providers that's federated with your intra tenant, that then those users could authenticate using their own accounts to be able to use your application and storing all that content inside of your SharePoint embedded instance, even though it's going to be in your tenant. So this whole experience is going to give us a very structured user experience, maybe very controlled collaboration. It may even go through and just give us a customer-facing way to be able to share content, because maybe the app is going to be smart enough to know that everybody that's in the tenant, so Microsoft employee, everybody that's in the tenant should have access to see some content, but the speakers shouldn't be able to see other speakers' content, or maybe content that just Microsoft was working on under embargo and other NDAs.
Yeah.
So that's one. The other, that's kind of a single tenant instance. A multi-tenant instance with this too, that's kind of interesting, is that, let's say you were a company that actually built this kind of software for managing a conference. I could build the software but then I don't have to worry about any of the data storage side to it at all. I can just provide the app, and I'm just then responsible for the cost of the compute and providing the service. The customers then would connect their own 365 tenant, or they would grant the app access to their 365 tenant, which would then go through and let it write all the content all being stored into the tenant of the customer. So that's more of a multi-tenant scenario,
and
where
the customer gets the bill then, that the ISV doesn't get the bill.
So so yes and no. That's kind of a work that they've publicly talked about. That's kind of a little bit of a work in progress, where right now the consumption of the cost would be assumed by the user. So the consumption of the storage would be consumed by the user. So you pay for this, and there's three ways you pay for it. You pay for it by storage. So how much content you have in your SharePoint embedded instance for that app. So this is all like a per app thing. You pay for it based on the amount of API calls that your app is responsible for. So if I store a good way to think about this, if I store an Excel file and I download it, and then I have my app let you download the file, and I give you a way to upload the file back to SharePoint Embedded, then my app is going to incur those API costs for like both the read and the write.
Okay.
But if instead my app lets you open up that Excel workbook using the Excel web app, that is not going to cost towards my tenant, towards the API calls, because that is not me. That is, my app is not triggering the reads and the writes. Yeah. So if you find content, like if you access content inside of like you see it in search or anything like that, that's not going to count against you, or count towards the bill. And then the third pricing meter that's there is for like content egress. So like the size of the egress of the content.
Yep.
So that's how it is today, or at least that's how it was at GA. And I'm not sure if this has changed yet, but I know that they're working on giving ISVs an option to where instead of the cost being assumed by the customer, ISVs could assume the cost on their own, which then gives
the customer a fixed sum or something.
Yeah, you could do a cost plus. You could have a markup on it for initial service.
Yeah.
There's different ways. It basically gives customers or ISVs who are building SharePoint embedded apps, it gives them the pricing structure to either do like a licensing model, on a per user basis, a licensing model based on like a monthly basis, or even a model based on how much you pay a small fee for the app, and then you pay more based on storage and consumption. So that's totally up to how the ISV would choose to do that. But what's cool then is that the ISV is then just responsible for the actual. They're responsible just for the what do you call it? The ISV is still responsible just for the app. The content is still stored in the customer's tenant.
Yeah.
But who pays for it is going to be flexible, where the ISV can choose to be the one that's going to get charged for what's in the customer's tenant, or the customer can just pay it directly. All of that is done through Azure, since Azure's more on a meter billing than 365 is.
Yeah.
So
that's neat.
Yeah. So that's like a bunch of like scenarios and kind of how a lot of this stuff works. But the neat thing about it, though, as far as a developer's concerned, is that if you're familiar with working with Microsoft Graph to read and write content to a document library, you're used to this stuff. I mean, it's the exact same thing. You use the exact same thing. Like, these containers, they're drive objects. So it's the same as working with like a document library or a OneDrive.
Yep. And you can use the SDKs, all the docs are the same. Like, it's an easy ramp for a lot of the existing SharePoint developers out there.
Yeah. So I can now like play the joke on Microsoft, where you thought that you had more than one OneDrive. Wait till you use SharePoint Embedded. You're going to have lots of OneDrives. You won't have one OneDrive. You may have like eight drives, 10 drives, 20 drives.
Another product that got renamed 3 times.
Yeah.
We could do a whole show on that.
Oh my God. So
there's a fair amount on like the ISV story multi-tenant scenario, but in the case of the Microsoft event management thing, that could have just been an internal dev house doing that. Mm-hmm. What do you think the benefits are of an internal dev house using that versus just spinning up a site collection and asking this SharePoint admin within the tenant, hey, look, give me one that I can use and give me site collection admin on it. Like, what do you think is a benefit there?
So there's a couple things I'm seeing with this. So one of them that's one of the things that I see people liking this. So that's a single tenant kind of instance where you're going to go build the app. You would build a SharePoint embedded app, and only people are going to be using it are the people within your tenant, right? So the choice is, do I just go use a new SharePoint site and a new site collection and then put all the content inside that site collection or inside of a team in Teams? Or do I use the app inside SharePoint Embedded? Well, one reason you may want to go through and do this inside of SharePoint Embedded instead of in SharePoint is that I don't want the content in this site to be available or accessible anywhere inside 365. I want it to be a full walled garden, right? Yep. I want to have a nice silo around this. I want to have a very controlled permissioning model around this. But I still want to leverage, again, all of my security and compliant S&C and all the other stuff that I have in my Purview investments to make sure that
and just, I mean, I know SharePoint sites you can mark as not being included in search, but they still show up in lots of other places regardless of that, right?
Yeah, they're still going to show up in lots of other places. And plus, I mean, you can have an easy like misconfiguration and all of a sudden that content is showing up where you don't want it to show up.
Yeah.
Plus, if this other thing is going to have a significant amount of content, it's going to go against your entire SharePoint Online entitlement. So you may end up having to buy additional storage based on how much you're using by the SharePoint embedded app. I mean, you think about it. Think about a law firm. Think about a company with like a law that's a law firm, and they want to have all of their content not stored in their like all 365 entitlement. They want to have this separate thing where all of their matter is going to be stored, or it's a third party that has built the app. And they want for the legal profession or like small law firms, they need to have this thing to be able to manage all of the content. They need to make sure that one lawyer can't see content on a case that they're not working. That is
in that case, would you be spinning up a different container per matter? Is that kind of where you were going earlier on with the scale numbers?
Yeah, that's the IA stuff that we find that people get a little tripped up with. And it was I had a great conversation. Oh my gosh, I just forgot. Wayne Ewington.
That's a blast from the past.
That's what I thought too. A lot of times I jumped into this stuff and I saw so many people on the call. I'm like, oh my God, I know like 2 or 3 of these guys. I haven't seen them in like 10 years.
Far out.
So that's a big scenario where I would find, especially in that workshop that we did back in March, people were asking a lot of IA questions. And so am I going to create one container per app, and then in that container, I'm going to have multiple folders?
Yeah.
Or I'm going to have multiple containers?
Yeah.
And do it. And it's the way that you want to think about it is first, think about it more like a security construct. Mm-hmm. So there's one fundamental difference between SharePoint Embedded and SharePoint document libraries that the old school SharePoint person and me, the 20 plus years of SharePoint I've been doing, that I found, I love this approach to SharePoint Embedded. SharePoint Embedded, you can only have additive permissions. You can't negate permissions. So in SharePoint, you know how you can break inheritance and say that, you can't see this file in this container, right?
Yep.
Or in this document library, but you can see everything else. You can't do that in SharePoint Embedded. So at the SharePoint Embedded space, you can be, if you have write access on a container, you have write access to all content throughout that container.
Right.
If you have read access on that container, you have read access to all content in that container, but at a level farther down, you can have write access to only a subset of the content in that container. So what that then does—
would that be like a folder?
Like a folder or a specific file or something. So it's part of that is for performance. But it also is just, to me, it really simplifies the permissioning model.
Yeah, it forces you to think about containers more so than breaking inheritance at a folder level.
So now when you think about a container, you think more like, I want to have it more of a security construct, and that I would never want to go through and have something that is more permissive. That I would try and restrict. So it's like, this is the most permissive I would want to have something. I'll create lots of those. So like, let's think law firm. Some people refer to them as projects. Generally, in the legal profession, they refer to them as matter.
Yeah.
And so it's like all the stuff related to a case.
And if it could be an engineering company that's having engineering projects, and each one's a container.
Exactly. Yeah.
Where would you see all the containers? Is there a Microsoft Admin Center screen where everyone can see everything, and the parent Azure Entra app ID that owns the collection container? Is that how things are done?
Yeah, there's a way that you can see the admin side inside of the SharePoint Admin Center. There's a whole place where you can look at the list of all the containers. You can look at the list of the apps and the list of the containers.
Right.
It gets very nuanced when you try to figure out it gets very nuanced when you try to understand let's see, how do I say this? What you have access to within the Mac, within the SharePoint Admin Center. And the reason for this, so think about this scenario. What if an admin, what if I built an app, and so there's no web interface except for the one that I own for my app.
Mm-hmm.
If I build an app and if my app has a lot of dependencies, like it's stored a bunch of content in different containers, some of it may be like configuration stuff or things that the app needs in order to work. If a SharePoint administrator or a SharePoint Embedded administrator goes into the SharePoint Admin Center, finds a container and deletes the container, it could completely wipe out the entire app.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of protections in place to keep that from happening. But furthermore, there also needs to be an option where, like, let's say somebody puts certain content into the app and all of a sudden something happens, like we've got to get this content out of here. It's like a, hell or high water, CEOs calling in the middle of the night. We have to have a way to nuke it. There's like a short circuit where you can still do that.
So the customer can overrule it. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It gets really nuanced. It's a little hard to go through on a podcast because I'm using my hands a lot on
the visual aspect of it. But then the other thing would be like, so it's all being done by Entra permissions. So, like an Entra app can be granted permissions to create collections, and once the SharePoint admins approve that, so then the app can go hell or high water and create as many collections as they want.
Yeah. So the way it works is that what you do is you go into Entra, you create an app in Microsoft Entra. You used to have to turn on SharePoint Embedded in your tenant. Now it's just automatically turned on. So in GA, it's like it's already there. You don't have to go through. You don't need an admin to go through and do that.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So you create an app in Microsoft Entra. That app is given a couple special permissions that are like special scopes. I think it's file storage container dot. I forget what it is, but it's like 2 or 3 scopes that are unique to it. Once you've done that, you then have to go into an Azure subscription that has been enabled for Microsoft Syntex, because Syntex was the old name for all this stuff.
Okay. And that's how the billing's done.
Yeah. And so what that does is you basically say, this app, this Azure subscription that you have, you create a resource group, you create a subscription, then you create a resource group inside of Azure. And then you go over to your 365 tenant and you say that you connect your 365 tenant to that Azure subscription and that resource group. That's how the billing is going to be managed.
Yeah.
And then you marry up the Entra ID app to that subscription.
Yeah.
And then the last thing has to be done is that an administrator, both on so we call them there's like a provider, the person who builds the app, and there's a consumer, which is the customers actually use the app. They may be one and the same, but regardless if they're one and the same and this is all being done in one tenant, you still have to do this. Once you've defined the Entra ID app, you then go in and create this thing called a container type, not a content type, but a container type that is married up to that app. What that does is that's the main connection between the content to the actual application that has the permissions. Once that's done, the consumer, you then have a thing where it says the container type is now connected to a customer's tenant. Once that's done, now the app will have access to create and manage containers programmatically in the customer's tenant or into the same tenant that the app was created in.
For those still listening.
Yeah, I know.
Andrew has just used virtual hands and fingers to point to about 2,000 different spots on his screen.
I know.
To articulate that.
I'll put this in, I'll make sure we have this in show notes. I've got 2 fairly long articles that also have like YouTube videos that accompany them that I'm actually in the middle of refreshing right now. I'll put links to those in the show notes, but there's a couple little drawings that kind of show where this stuff works. And then on the tutorial, it like walks through like step by step. Here's how you create an app. So
yeah. And it's been interesting in the fact that we've had our own internal products use this, but also some big names in the ecosystem use this that people are familiar with that I may have worked for in the past as well for people that follow along.
Yeah.
And it's definitely a scenario that makes sense. If you're already a SharePoint developer, like you said at the beginning of the show, and you're using SharePoint in this scenario, it's definitely worth investigating this.
Yeah.
But I also think to your other point of if you've got a construct of a file in your product and your customer base is a Microsoft 365 customer, this also totally makes sense to consider it.
Yeah.
And maybe you are using Azure Files, you may be using Azure Blob Service, but this is going to, or Azure Blob Storage, sorry, this is going to give you a ton more features that your customer will be a lot more used to and familiar with.
Yeah.
And, my experience is working at 2 different bigger software companies in the ecosystem was the more you can point to PaaS products that you're using, it gets rid of a lot of the RFQ kind of privacy compliance concerns because effectively you're saying, look, we're using this and therefore here is the privacy, security and compliance aspects of it.
Yeah.
Especially if you're doing something like a SOC 2 compliance, going and building your own file system and having SOC 2 over it versus using something like this would actually be significantly quicker, which in talking to some of the ISVs in the ecosystem that have used this already was some of the major reasons they did this.
So I think those are all very good points. There's one bit of pushback that I always get from customers when I talk about this with them. And they're like, they go and they look at the pricing for it.
Yeah.
And they're like, it's so much more expensive or not. So it's more expensive. I won't say so much more. It's more expensive than just using Azure storage. I'm like, well, yeah, it's going to be because think about what you're getting for it. Now, I'm not saying that this is the best solution for every single app that's got document-centric storage, document-centric storage needs. But all the stuff you just said, great reason why you would want to consider doing this, because now I don't have to go worry about all of that security and compliance certifications, or if I've got to go like different kinds of privacy, all the stuff that Purview and like SharePoint brings to the table out of the box, all those enterprise content management features that SharePoint brings to the box.
Or even the Office client editing the document, that's very hard to do.
Yeah. And I think that when you look at all that stuff that the premium you're paying for the storage for this service, you have to look at it and say, is it worth that cost? Or am I going to build out all of those features and have to maintain all of that code?
There's an architect out there that's totally going to go, we're going to go build those things ourselves. But that's fine.
I'm sure. Oh, totally. I mean, I've worked with we can do security better than Microsoft can. I'm like, look,
I could spend an hour talking about the architects. I know we'll go that path too. But we won't.
I know. Totally. I mean, I heard it. I hear it all the time. Like, oh no, we can't go to the cloud. We have to go on-prem. So our security is much more important than the cloud. I'm like, really? You think that Microsoft has nothing invested in their future with Azure, right? Okay, good luck. Anyway, but the thing is, I'll refrain from the CrowdStrike joke right now. But
please
but I think that you have to look at it and just say, like, is what I'm getting worth the premium that I'm paying for all of this? Yeah. Because I now don't have to worry about implementing a search experience. And that search experience is going to just optionally will have all of that just light up right inside of everywhere else through 365 if I turn that on optionally. But I still have access to all of that stuff. So yeah, I think it's cool because there are lots of options with it. You can go through and use Azure Storage or Azure Blob Storage for this for your documents, but if you've got a document-centric solution and you need to have these extra features for like enterprise content management stuff, I think it's a great solution to consider. So
it is kind of funny. I just went on the SharePoint Embedded pages and was like, oh, I wonder what the pricing is because I haven't seen it for a while. And in true style, I'll give this feedback to Reed and Sham. It's really hard to find in the docs. Whereas if you thought about other products out there that are PASI that do this kind of thing too, and which I know was one of the words they were leaning on. Pricing would be front and center on the product page.
So I know where the pricing is. It's going to take me a second to go find it, but let me just give you a little bit of a metric here. And to anybody listening to this, pricing changes. So go look for this in the docs. Like you'll find this in the developer docs. But I remember at one point it was something like you pay somewhere in the ballpark of like 2 cents per gigabyte of storage if you're in Azure storage, where SharePoint Embedded is somewhere in the ballpark of like 15 to 18 cents per gigabyte of storage. So you are paying, it is a premium.
It's a value thing. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a value, but it's a value thing. Like where are you going to put your money? Right. And now you can make a case on both sides of this, but you can make a very compelling case that it is more expensive than Azure storage, but you're not having to build all the features that's saving you time. You're not having to maintain those. And you get all the security compliance and certifications and stuff that Microsoft has already done for SharePoint. You get all that as part of that payment. So maybe that's important to you. Maybe it isn't, but at least you have that option. So
what's the best way to get started on all this? I know I can see a few things here, but where would you send someone?
Call me. No, I'm just kidding. So there's a couple things. I'll put this. I'll have some. You can find some of this stuff in like the two links or a couple links I'll put in the show notes. There are 2 Microsoft Learning modules that were published to Microsoft Learning that I created for the team. They're linked to in the docs, in the SharePoint Embedded docs. I'll make sure that we have links to those in the show notes. One of them has you get your tenant up and running. The other one has you walk through and create a SharePoint Embedded app. So they're fairly meaty examples of this. If you go to the 2 links that I'll have for articles on my site and the links to the equivalent YouTube videos, they also walk you through it. So my YouTube video of the tutorial of creating your first SharePoint Embedded app, it's about an hour long. It's going to get refreshed really soon because I haven't updated it yet for GA. But I will have that updated.
When did it GA too?
GA'd in May. I think it build.
Oh, wow. Okay.
GA'd in May of 2024.
That's awesome.
So it was private preview from around build of 2023. It went public preview at the European SharePoint conference in November of 2023. And then it went GA in May.
In May this year.
Of 2024.
Awesome.
Yep.
Well, I really appreciate you pushing that through. We're at the 50-minute mark, so we'll wrap this one up. But thank you so much, man. I appreciate it. It's good to get your perspective on this after getting Reed and Mark on before. And we'll make sure the show notes are in there. If you've got feedback on the show, please definitely reach out to us. We are monitoring the socials, and I encourage you to share this with people who are interested in this stuff. We are trying to expand the show after kind of rebooting it again after having a little bit of a break. So the more words going around this, we'd really appreciate it. And, it's nice that Joey reached out. I was like, wow, it's really great that so many people that I know are listening to the show. So thank you for those that are listening and continuing to subscribe to this. We really appreciate it.
Yeah. You just have to get Joey on more than once a year.
Yeah, that's what we were saying in the show. I told him that he needs to ship more to come on.
There you go.
Excellent. All right. Well, everyone have a great week, and we'll catch you on the flip side.
Yeah, man. Sounds good. Thanks, Jeremy. See you later, everybody.
Thanks for listening to the Microsoft 365 Dev Podcast. Check out our show notes on www.m365devpodcast.com and follow us on X at M365devpodcast. We'd really appreciate it if you could give us a review on Apple Podcasts too. That's all, folks.